Thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you can hear me. I'm not going to introduce the panel yet, but I am going to give you a couple pieces of housekeeping. The most important part is please turn off your phones. We want to make sure everyone here gets the opportunity to hear what I know is going to be a really interesting discussion. I've been told this room is a little hard to find, so I think we'll expect a trickle of additional people joining us. So with that said, we're going to leave plenty of time for discussion with all of you, so listen hard for only the first part of the session and get ready to be part of this interesting discussion with us. We're going to start with a video. Well, thank you again for joining us. Hopefully that video has got your energy level up after lunch. It's okay if you want to dance a little. I have seen people dance to that before, but I can't because I'm here tied to the other end of my microphone. But I'm Susan Myers, Senior Vice President of the UN Foundation, and I'm really privileged to be here at my first ever Skoll World Forum on stage with this distinguished group that we have here. We are here to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals. I wanted you to see that video because that video does a better job than I can possibly do conveying what the SDGs are and what their potential is. It was actually not produced by the UN Foundation. It was produced by a group called Project Everyone that is based here in the UK, co-founded by the filmmaker and anti-poverty activist Richard Curtis, along with Kate Garvey, and they've been working hard even before the Sustainable Development Goals were created to ensure that the world knew about them and knew ways that they could get engaged. The SDGs, I know this is an audience that is probably familiar with the SDGs, but of course we're talking about the potential to have the first generation that can live without extreme poverty, the most committed generation that addresses income inequalities and the inequalities that hold so many people back in the world, and the last generation to suffer the impact of climate change. That is what the SDGs are about. When I watched that video, I've of course seen it before, but when I watched that video yesterday, thinking about the overall theme of the Skoll World Forum, I was worried that the tone might be a little off, I think partly because of that catchy music. But then when I thought about it a bit more and thinking about the spirit that I know our friends at Skoll want to bring into this forum, I actually thought it was perfect. And then when I read Sally Osberg's call to action in our program, where she said, "Now is a moment to renew our common cause, to forge bold partnerships, to bridge all that divides. Now is a moment we must reunite with those left behind and spurned. Now is the moment to embrace our common humanity." I thought this is actually exactly what the Sustainable Development Goals are about. So I'm really glad that this panel is happening at the Skoll World Forum. The SDGs are, of course, an ambitious agenda. They're about not just going halfway, which was really the approach we had with their predecessor goals, the Millennium Development Goals. They seek to not only eliminate extreme poverty, but to tackle this goal through an approach that involves economic development, an approach that involves ensuring that we have a healthy planet to be able to sustain progress for many years to come. So they're complicated, but I think that the SDGs are, for that reason, also very real, because the world is, of course, a complicated place, but of course begs an approach that involves everyone in this room, people across sectors and around the world, and really demand action by all of us. And now, of course, the topic of this panel is global goals in an uncertain world. Of course, we have to think about the SDGs now in the context we're living in, which is some of the new political dynamics that we've seen over the last year. There was a session here at the forum last year on the SDGs, which probably had a different tone to it, a tone of real promise and momentum. I think that momentum is still there, but we do have to, of course, take into account the impact of what's happened over the last year, and the fact that certain governments that we thought might have been some of the front runners and leading the world on this new agenda may not be, in fact, the leaders we thought they were. We have to think about the fact that in some of those countries, the whole idea of having global goals might seem counter to some of the dynamics that are driving populism and some of these political movements. But I think, I, along with my panelists here, one of the goals we have is to actually counter that assertion. And it's something we'll talk about in today's discussion. So I'm going to turn to the panel in a moment, but just wanted to tease out a few of the things we are going to talk about, because we do want to make sure that you all are part of this discussion as well. So I want you to start thinking about these goals we have. We're here, of course, to talk about how to sustain momentum on the Sustainable Development Goals, especially during times of political transition. How can we ensure that action continues at all levels, so we're not just reliant on political leaders at the highest level to keep us pointed in the right direction? I know we never have been, but I think in this context we have to think about this even harder. And also, how can we, of course, given the audience we have here at the Skoll Forum, how can we empower social entrepreneurs to work on the SDGs? How can we ensure that they have access to the full range of resources they need to bring their work to the next level? And how can we think about bringing down some of the barriers that they face that prevents us from doing this effectively? And finally, how can we, I referenced this in the first goal, but how can we really empower action at all levels? So I do know that this is a crowd that knows the SDGs, but I want to, before we turn to the panel, get a sense of exactly who we're talking to here. I've been really pleased my first 24 hours here to hear a lot of people bring the SDGs up. This isn't, I promise, just because I'm asking about them. But how many people in this room are actively using the SDGs for the work that they're doing now? Great. Keep your hands up. How many people are thinking about integrating the SDGs more into their work, but just haven't had a chance to do this yet? Great. Okay, hands down. Just one more question. How many people think that it's more important than ever to work on the SDGs given some of the political issues we're facing in the world? Good, me too. I should have raised my hand both times. So with this, thank you for participating in that. We'll be back to you shortly. But I want to, of course, turn to our panel. And I'm going to start with somebody I think that this room might already know pretty well. Vivek Maru. He actually won the Skoll Award for Social Entrepreneurship last year here at the Forum. I understand he's also been called a legal rebel by the American Bar Association, which actually means a lot to me because the ABA hired me my first job out of university.
Dubious distinction.
Yeah, well, maybe. I was only there a year.
Oh, I mean the legal rebel thing.
But he is currently the CEO of an organization called Namati. He's been there since 2011 and has actually been one of the forces behind the inclusion of legal empowerment in the Sustainable Development Goals. In particular, this is an issue that's embedded into Goal 16. So Vivek, I just wanted to start by asking you to talk a little bit about Goal 16. It's one of the newer parts of the agenda if you compare it to the predecessor goals. So yes. Why is this so important? Why is it different? And where do we need to be going?
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me. Thank you guys for coming. Goal 16. Goal 16 is my favorite one. Does anybody remember the original Millennium Development Goals? They were adopted in 2000. A bit fewer than the SDGs, which I guess is progress, that the awareness is growing. The MDGs were adopted in 2000, extremely laudable things. It was reduce child mortality by 2/3, cut in half the number of people that are hungry in the world, totally laudable things. But they made no mention at all of questions of justice or fairness or accountability or corruption. Those things, those words did not show up at all in the original MDGs. And so and the MDGs were expiring in 2015, and when the conversation started about what the 2030, the SDGs should look like, the new development framework, our basic argument was that we have made progress between 2000 and say 2014. We made significant progress, but we are miserably behind what justice demands, and we're not going to get there. We're not going to achieve any of those essential things, whether it's hunger or healthcare or education access. We're not going to achieve any of those things if we don't take justice head on. You can't ignore those core questions. And at the time, even sympathetic officials, our friends at the UN, said to us, keep dreaming. You know, that sounds nice, but not going to happen because too many governments around the world were committed to keeping development kind of economic and technocratic. And this idea of incorporating justice in the development framework felt too political, too contentious. But a kind of campaign emerged around the world. Peter Gabriel joined, which always helps. Bishop Tutu joined, and hundreds of grassroots organizations around the world who pressured their own national capitals and pressured the UN, saying that we need justice to be a part of development. And we squeaked in. We just barely squeaked in, 16th out of 17. We just made it, and Susan was saying that up to the night before, it wasn't quite clear that that was going to happen, but we made it, 16th out of 17, just made it. Meanwhile, guess who else has been railing about inequality and unfairness, sort of along the same time period? Any guesses? Inequality, unfairness. Authoritarian nativist leaders have been saying the same thing, from Duterte in the Philippines to Viktor Orban in Hungary to Donald J. Trump in the country that I live in. When people like Trump say the system is rigged, people know it's true. It's true. It's true that the system is rigged. And there's sort of two options. There's kind of two options that you can take when you encounter that fundamental truth. One option, door number one, is the Trump option. The Trump option is, trust me, I'm going to turn the system upside down. It's rigged, I'm going to turn it upside down. Put your trust in me. The other option is, don't abandon the institutions altogether. Give the people the power to transform those institutions, to make them more fair, more accountable, more democratic. And Goal 16 represents that second option. And pursuing that second option, making it happen, turning those words into reality, is more urgent than ever.
Well, thank you. Thank you for going, I think, directly to where we want to be going with this discussion. We, of course, didn't know what was going to happen over the coming 2 years when the SDGs were adopted, and I can attest, having seen some of the negotiations in New York, at how hard it was to get Goal 16 in the agenda, but I think it's even more important that it's there. So Lauren, I'm going to turn to you. Lauren is the founder and CEO of Biocarbon Engineering. He's the reason why we have this device on stage, which he's going to talk a little bit about. I've had the privilege of getting to know Lauren over the last couple of years, including over the last few days, if you heard the Denver karaoke reference, as Lauren was part of the inaugural class of the Solutions Summit, which the UN Foundation launched with the UN literally the day that the SDGs were adopted in September 2015, in partnership at the time with the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy and a number of governments, to highlight and elevate solutions that we knew were already happening around the world that would drive progress and momentum on the SDGs. So Lauren was one of 14 selected in that inaugural class. His work has progressed and continues to develop since then. But it might seem a little counterintuitive that he's going to be talking about drone technology in the context of a rights-based sustainable development agenda. But Lauren, I want to give you a chance to just talk about what you're doing and why you think it's important to be linking it to the SDGs.
Right, so ours is probably most closely tied to number 15, life on land. And it really comes down to a question of scale. If you look at the SDGs, they're very locally focused, but at the same time, they're such a large problem that they really are a global problem. So how do you create solutions that provide a local impact, but actually can scale to a global impact? So I'll talk a little bit about the scale of the problem. About 15 billion trees a year are destroyed. And despite a significant international planting efforts, a net loss of about 6 billion trees remains. So for the 1 billion people who live in these forest communities around the world, this isn't really just a loss of trees. This is a loss of healthy ecosystems, biodiversity, food, jobs. For the rest of us, this affects the supply chain for everyday products that we all need. So it really is big business at the same time. And governments have recognized this. And there are a number of really great initiatives out there that are pushing the agenda for restoration of degraded lands to the tune of 350 million hectares. This is an area the size of India and equates to another 300 billion trees. So if you have a net loss annually and you pile another 300 billion trees on top of that, how are we ever going to get there? Well, the state of the art needs new solutions. They need help, but they need to be included in that as you're developing those issues. Our solution is industrial scale aerial robotics, drones that plant trees. You can go ahead and start that video now. The solution works in two phases. First, we take detailed images of the terrain, the nutrients, and the biodiversity. And we crunch that information through a machine learning algorithm in order to produce a precise planting pattern. This planting pattern is then uploaded into the drone. These fly at about 10 feet or 3 meters off the ground, and they fire a small biodegradable seed pod into each of the predetermined positions. These contain the nutrients, a healthy seed, and everything that they need in order to grow this into a healthy tree. With 150 swarms of 6 drones each, we will have the capacity to plant 1 billion trees a year, but with the potential to scale to tens of billions of trees each year. And we're going to have to, because the problem is really huge. And in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, this isn't just an issue of the environment. We do, at this scale, improve the local healthy ecosystems, water production cycles, nutrient soil production cycles, increased downstream agricultural productivity, as well as massive scale social uplift. For every dollar spent in reforestation, about $2.50 is generated in local income and benefits. So by planting at the scale, we expect to be able to double the daily income of millions of families in the lowest economic brackets around the world.
Great. So in other words, bringing the cool factor to the UN. But I think when you see what Lauren's doing and what his initiative has the potential to do, it's even more clear why we need to be breaking down some of the barriers that allow these solutions to move forward. Alyssa Goldberg, who I think has also brought some cool factor to the UN in her days.
I've never been referred to as the cool factor.
Well, you are now. She currently serves as Assistant Deputy Minister for Partnerships and Development in Canada's Ministry of Global Affairs. Previous to that, and the reason why I made this reference is that she was Canada's Ambassador and Permanent Representative to the UN in Geneva, where we had the privilege to work together on a number of things. Before that, also serving in the Canadian government, she was Director General of the Canadian Government Stabilization and Reconstruction Task Force in Kandahar, Afghanistan. So she's obviously used to being in tough environments. Maybe this won't be quite as tough of an environment as Afghanistan was. But I hope you don't mind. I'm going to ask you a bit of a tough question, which is that, it's given that you're on stage with 2 entrepreneurs, given that the crowd here is really made up of social entrepreneurs, you're a bit of an anomaly. So what made it important for you to prioritize being here at the Skull World Forum? Why is Canada focused on entrepreneurship and solutions?
So for us, the Sustainable Development Goals are driving both our philosophy domestically and internationally, and the Prime Minister has made clear that that is his intent. It was included as part of the narrative in the national budget that was launched last week. He put it in the mandate letters for his ministers, and he made it clear that that was his expectation. So certainly for us, the boss has spoken, and therefore we will execute. But we were actively involved in the design of the SDGs because we really did feel that that was going to be the pathway forward, and we needed to make sure that we were going to be setting ourselves up for success. So one of the things that we've been thinking a lot about over the course of the last year was, as an entity that's very outward facing, as a Ministry of Global Affairs, were we set up for success? So we had the SDGs come out, there was the World Humanitarian Summit, there were the Paris discussions, and were we going to be able to actually fulfill the expectations that were outlined in those documents that we helped to design? And the answer to that question was no. We undertook an extensive public consultation process over the course of the last year to try to figure out how could we be better aligned to help advance the Sustainable Development Goals. And a big part of that is this focus on innovation. We really do believe that doing, from our vantage point, if I'm looking at it just on the international, and we can talk about the domestic separately, but as someone who's responsible for looking at how we do development, it's clear that we don't have all the tools that we need in the toolkit to advance the kind of work that folks in this room are doing. So we've spent a lot of time thinking about the how. How is it that we're enabling the kind of work that colleagues want to be doing? Are we investing in equity stakes, for instance, in institutions? Do we have the ability to do that? Can we do repayable contributions, for instance? Can we take first loss guarantees? Can we think about pro-poor opportunities when we're designing initiatives? How do we make sure that the World Bank, and we're just about to create our own DFI, our development financing institution, how do we make sure that it's pro-poor in its orientation, which then encourages investment opportunities by social entrepreneurs, but not just social entrepreneurs, also other kinds of private sector stakeholders. The other piece of this is also looking at how do we create the space for a conversation with the private sector, for instance, around the Sustainable Development Goals. The UN isn't necessarily inherently a networked environment for that kind of a conversation. And to be fair, that makes sense, right? It was created to be a statist organization. But again, the reality is that if we're going to establish progress against the SDGs, if we're going to achieve the ambitions that we've all set out for ourselves, the institution is going to have to shift. It's going to have to create spaces where there's a more meaningful conversation with the private sector, for instance, but not just the private sector. One of the things we were talking amongst ourselves about earlier was it has to create a space for more meaningful partnerships at a variety of different levels. So that means creating spaces for cities and mayors, where I think, frankly, some of the most interesting work to advance the Sustainable Development Goals is happening. It's at the local level, it's at the city level, where all of the SDGs come to play, right? So SDG, I'm very fond of SDG 16, but also SDG 5, gender equality. I happen to work on SDG 9 quite a bit, which is innovation. SDG 1, no poverty. This all kind of hits the road at the city level, and it hits the road with entrepreneurs. So we need to figure out, and we're trying to design a whole series of new instruments in conjunction with a lot of our partners to figure out how we can do that better.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to mix it up a little and turn back to Lauren, because I think you hit some important themes related to investments and kind of the role of the various players and working together to ensure that entrepreneurs, the private sector, others kind of are working together in a more integrated way. So Lauren, I mean, I know one of the challenges your initiative faces is the need for, for more capital and a different kind of capital. So can you talk a bit, especially to some of the investors that I know we have here in the audience, and some of the barriers you're facing and some thoughts you have for how we can bring down those barriers?
Yeah, so one of the things that's actually quite interesting is that we're tied really closely to this location. In fact, the first time I pitched this idea was in a room not too far from here in the other building. Pamela Hartigan was here, who we miss and love dearly, and her response was, You're going to do what? But it opened the door to a Skoll Venture Award, which was £20,000, and what that allowed us to do was turn this idea into a technology demonstrator. And with that technology demonstrator, we were able to unlock opportunities from there to get us to a first level of funding, and that really was helpful at that stage. But as we get to later stages, especially in the SDGs, we need organizations that are willing to take a leap of faith, that are willing to put up capital and revenue opportunities in particular to organizations like ours that are still early stage, that have some risk there that the traditional VC are just not going to put money into just yet. In fact, I just spent a month in Silicon Valley storming Sand Hill Road, talking to all the best VC, and they love the idea. Come back and talk to us when you have a revenue stream. Well, it's how difficult it is to create a revenue stream that in a meaningful way that those capital investment type firms are going to put money into. So what we really, and the fact is we have a huge advantage over a lot of other companies. We have scalability in spades. If we hit the scale of 1 billion trees a year and 10 billion trees a year, there's no doubt that we could turn this into a unicorn. There's no doubt about it. It's just such a big global problem that's the kind of revenue that we're talking. The majority of organizations out there are really not in the same class and scale that we're at, but the opportunities that they're addressing for local scale problems, and whether they're looking at a 10-person company or a 100-person company, they're not quite hitting that kind of scale that you need for those sorts of investment organizations. So what do you call a business that employs that? Good business, sustainable business. That's great stuff. So we just need to create financing mechanisms and convince organizations like a lot of the foundations here, the same thing, too risk aversive. The foundations also need to start taking a look at unlocking some of that capital and take a little higher risk on projects that could scale or could address local problems in a way that's really meaningful. And so that's the kind of things that I think that would be really helpful. Without beating up, everybody wants to do it. There's only so much money, but we need to figure out how to get that money and leverage it. From our perspective, this isn't about always having money driven in. If you take a look at WRI and you take a look at WWF and UNEP and the UNCCD, what they want to really see is private capital driven into ecosystem restoration. They don't want government money to be doing it all the time. They want to drive private capital in. But we're at that early stage where private capital isn't going to come in, and yet those organizations aren't unlocking projects to empower us to get in there, do work so that we can demonstrate to the private capital market that this is a good place to invest money. And I think that goes across the board for a lot of other types of organizations.
Do you want to respond back to that at all, as just what this looks like from the government standpoint, or just to continue the thread here?
What I'd say is I'm in violent agreement.
Yeah.
I think there's a couple of challenges. I mean, one is, so we're used to providing investment, but our investment alone will only snip at a piece of the SDGs, right? This is why the private capital has to come in. Now, what we're prepared to do is blended finance initiatives, right? If that's going to help attract investors to come into the space, then fantastic. But that means we need to better understand what is it that the private sector needs, what's the enabling environment that they need in order to be willing to do that. And some of this is, and our ambassador in New York, who comes from the private sector, has been having this conversation and trying to encourage it. And partly this is, can we get the markets to think longer term? Right? The focus is also very much on short-termism. How do I get short-term results, short-term returns on investment for my shareholders today, where the SDGs is a long-term agenda. So how do we get them to be incentivized positively and potentially using regulation as another tool in the toolkit to say, if you're not going to invest in things that advance sustainable development goals, well, we'll set up a structure that encourages you to do so, right? So there's a carrot and stick that's involved in this. So I think Lauren's absolutely right. The question then is, how do we use these blended finance tools? In what sectors are they going to be most beneficial, right? Because they won't necessarily be beneficial across the board. So where is it the right place to do it? And again, as a government, it's taxpayer dollars. So the taxpayer, being a venture capitalist, is a slightly awkward space. And there has to be a bit of a social compact that, yes, a portion of the portfolio that we would normally spend on international assistance can be high risk, but we will also have to be able to tell a results story that is impactful and usable and understandable by a variety, cross-section of the public.
Well, thank you. And I'd just also point everyone to a report that came out in January of the Commission on Business and Sustainable Development, which goes much more into these issues, but really articulates the business case for the SDGs. But we are ultimately all here because we believe in the Sustainable Development Goals and its potential for helping people. So Vivek, I mean, we're all here for that reason, but I think you also have some stories you want to tell us to kind of get a little bit more into this issue of legal empowerment, why it's so important that it's part of the SDGs. I think you may have some images you want to show as well. If we could cue those up.
I mean, so Goal 16, this historic recognition, right, that hadn't happened before, that justice, that development needs justice, and that people can't improve their lives if they can't exercise their rights. And that cuts through all of the other ones. It doesn't stand by itself, whether it's gender or land or environment or health. This basic question of access to justice really does cut across. But I think it's a really important question. How do you achieve that? How do you turn those nice words into reality? And historically, lawyers have had this role of providing people with access to the law. Any lawyers in the house? Couple. I'm a lawyer too. I love you guys. I mean, I some of my best friends are lawyers. But we have limits. We have limits. Lawyers tend to be expensive. They tend to be focused on formal court channels, which are not practical for most of the problems that most people face. And moreover, law has been associated historically with this sort of expert culture, this complex thing that is difficult for ordinary people to understand. And so the group that I work with, Namati, we focus on community legal workers. Sometimes we say community paralegals or barefoot lawyers, who can be a bridge between formal legal systems on the one hand and real life on the other hand. And what these paralegals do is they help people to understand, break down law, demystify it, help people to understand it, and help people to pursue practical solutions to injustices that they face. I'll give you one example. This is Devram Rabari, who is from Gujarat, India, which is the state where my own family comes from. And 45 years ago, a renowned multinational company, Tata, came to his village and said, we need you guys to move because we want to build an industrial facility here, and displace the entire village, and provided new housing in a new place, which was okay, until 10 years ago, they built this cement factory literally right behind where the new village is. And India's got a strong environmental regulatory regime on the books, lots of good environmental laws on the books in India. But this cement factory has violated those laws left and right, so much so that the water in Devram's village is poisoned. The air is unbreathable. I spent 2 days there and I was coughing for a week afterward. And he's a herdsman. He's a shepherd, basically, and he depends upon animals for his livelihood. If the animals eat anything that grows in his village at this point, they get sick. So his kids have dropped out of school and they have walked hundreds of kilometers with the buffalo and the cattle looking for fodder, for grass and for things that the animals can eat. That is his situation. And he has been protesting this company for years. Protest. At one point, he was so frustrated that he said he publicly announced that he would kill himself, set himself on fire. And he had a bucket of petrol at the gates of the factory and was ready to do this. He got arrested before he could follow through. But he said to me that one and all the other protests, the company just kind of brushed off like dirt on their shoulder. They didn't take him seriously. They dismissed him. Last year, though, he met this guy. Forgive my terrible photography. But he met this guy. His name is Hasmukh. And Hasmukh is a part of a team of paralegals who focus on environmental justice on the Gujarat coast. And Hasmukh explained to Devram that this company is bound by rules and conditions. There are all these things when they get their clearance letter to operate. There's 100 conditions in there. Yes, you can operate, but these are the things you need to do. Devram can't read or write, but Hasmukh broke it down in simple terms in his own language about what these things said. And that was a revelation. Once he had that information, they collected evidence on how what is happening in reality is different from what is written on paper. And they submitted an application, not to the court system, but to India's administrative institutions. And India has many administrative institutions with the power to enforce, but they're often sleeping on that power. So eventually someone from the Pollution Control Board, the Gujarat State Pollution Control Board, which is one of those administrative institutions, came and paid a visit based on this application that they put in. And since then, the company has started covering the 100 trucks that go and come from this factory every day, which till then had been going uncovered. And they started using a filtration system for their emissions, which they were supposed to have been using all along. And those two things have significantly reduced the air pollution where Devram lives. The case is far from over. The place is still heavily polluted, and his kids have not been able to come home yet. But this experience of working with Hasmukh, learning the law, using the law, Devram told me that this was the first time that he felt like, I don't have to go beg the company for mercy, but I have some power. I have the law on my side. I'm able to invoke the authority of the state. And that process has changed his whole outlook. He's not talking about suicide anymore. He's hopeful. He's focused on action. So Namati works directly with paralegals in 8 different countries on big justice issues, tough justice issues. So it's environmental justice in India. In Kenya, we work on citizenship rights, where 30% of the population of Kenya is subject to a discriminatory vetting process if you want to get an ID card. You literally get sent to a different line. It's like the Jim Crow South in the United States. In Myanmar, we work on land rights, where people's land has been stolen for the last 50 years during the dictatorship, and there are some new land laws that allow farmers to try to recover land that was grabbed by the military over the last half century. In Mozambique, my teammate Ellie is here. We work on the right to health. So there's progressive healthcare policies, but lots of breakdowns in delivery, and paralegals help people to exercise rights to basic healthcare. Outside of those 8 countries, one of them, by the way, is the United States. I was happy to hear Alyssa mention the domestic Canadian agenda being shaped by the SDGs. That's one of the important things about the SDGs that differentiates them from the original MDGs, is that they're universal. They apply everywhere. And this question of access to justice is a universal one. So we're also working on a paralegal effort in the United States. In addition to that, we host a global network. I invite all of you to it. It's called the Global Legal Empowerment Network. We're the convening organization, but there are many, many members, 1,000 groups from 150 countries all over the world. And we are learning from each other, we're collaborating. We would like to see barefoot lawyers serving communities everywhere, from the streets of Washington, D.C., where I live, to Kinshasa, to the forests of Borneo.
Great, thank you very much for making this more personal and for telling those stories. And I want to turn to Alyssa again to maybe pick up on this theme of the universality of the Sustainable Development Goals, because Canada is, of course, a leader on the global stage, is backing a number of initiatives when it comes to ensuring that the SDGs have momentum in other parts of the world. But at the same time, there's a domestic component of this agenda for you as well. So how are you thinking about that? But also, how are you thinking about it in terms of potential political transitions in the future when you may not have the amazing prime minister that you have now that's as committed to this agenda?
You have a permanent public service. That's no.
Yes.
No, I'm so glad that Vivek made the point, because my good friend, I think many people will know John MacArthur, and John has said on a number of occasions that the only way we're really going to succeed on the SDGs globally is if we pull them down at the local level, and they have to be meaningful for people across the board. And this is something that we've been struggling with, this idea of universality, that the fact that the SDGs will apply to us at home as much as they will apply to the work that we're doing in the international sphere is something that we've been having a lot of conversations about. And it's really interesting because, of course, we're also a federation. So in a federal system, there's certain things that fall within the ambit of the national government, that there's things that fall into to the provinces and territories. And then, of course, there's the role of the cities and municipalities. So there's lots of different layers of accountability that have to be part of the conversation about how do you make the SDGs real at a local level. And what's been interesting here is the conversations that we're having at different levels. So it starts certainly with the Ministry of Global Affairs turning to our domestic colleagues and saying, hey, Ministry of Economic and Social Development Affairs, you're looking at doing a national poverty reduction strategy, SDG 1. No poverty, right? And making that connection for the domestic departments that what they're doing has an important connection to the Sustainable Development Goals. And if we look at some of our national priorities at the moment, where we are now using the SDGs as a policy frame, there's a focus on reducing domestic inequalities. And we're a young country. We recognize that we have difficulties on the social, economic, and cultural sphere. We have a lot of work to do, for instance, on Indigenous peoples and with Indigenous peoples. And the Prime Minister has prioritized this, and that includes questions of access to justice. I mentioned the poverty reduction strategy. There's climate change that's been a focus, and how the design of our new climate change strategy has really been influenced by the SDGs, by the Paris Accords, National Child Care Program, and thinking about that through the lens of the Sustainable Development Goals. Innovation and infrastructure. In the budget that was put forward last week, for instance, we announced a venture capital fund for national infrastructure. So it's not just a question of these issues being significant internationally, it's also how are we adapting them to our own local context. And what's really been interesting is to see how much energy and enthusiasm civil society organizations have had for implementing the SDGs, not just in their work overseas, but how it's starting to resonate across the country. So we support these provincial and territorial councils for international cooperation. And I'm really, this is where I'm seeing this intermesticity moving back and forth, where these councils have been having conversations in all of the provinces about the Sustainable Development Goals. In BC, they had discussions with, in British Columbia, they had discussions with 2,200 communities to say, well, how are the communities thinking about the Sustainable Development Goals? And now they're going to do a social mapping of it. Alberta just did a 30 under 30, which focused on 30 amazing young people who are focused on the Sustainable Development Goals. Ontario has had launched a long consultation process, significant discussion about how is the province going to implement the SDGs. That's being led by these civil society organizations in conjunction with cultural communities, think tanks, universities, the private sector. So it's really resonating in a way that when we were negotiating them, we in the Ministry of Global Affairs, we certainly wouldn't have anticipated that you could have that national enthusiasm to bring them down to the domestic level. But there is going to be a need for us to think about, well, how are we going to measure that? How are we going to report on that? Because we have to be held accountable just as we're expecting that the international work is going to be held accountable. So it's a really interesting time for us as we think about it. We don't have a national framework for it yet, but we're hoping to work towards one.
Great, thank you very much. And I think that is one of the most exciting things about the SDGs is that a lot is just organically happening. I feel like every day I'm at something like this, I learn of a new initiative, and it's not because the UN or a government has asked somebody to do it, it's because people are really resonating with the agenda. I have a lot more questions I could ask all of you, but I promise both our organizers at SCOL, but also our panel, the opportunity to engage with all of you. So we're going to turn to the audience. We have 2 microphones that are going to be floating around. We may take a few questions at once and then turn back to the panel just to make sure we have time to let everyone who wants to ask a question jump in. Great, maybe starting right here. Louise.
So my commitment to the world is SDG 4 in Africa specifically, and I'm very aware of how everybody says yes, SDG 4 is really important, education, and yet when I look at SDG funders, the funding thing around education and where the funding is going. It's all focused on higher education into Africa. There's absolutely no funding coming into basic education, primary education, And the challenge in Africa is that our children can't read. And if they can't read, they're not going to be able to go to tertiary education, and they're definitely not going to be able to benefit from the digital economy. And we need to find a way of shifting that and making the case for basic education to be funded in Africa.
Thank you.
And I'd love to know, obviously, your thoughts about how we could make that happen.
Okay. We'll table that and take a couple more. Right here in the front row.
First of all, congratulations. All four of you are awesome. Big fans of everything you do. I'm also a millennial, and I have a question for you, Suzanne, because
I'm not, by the way.
Sorry?
No, I'm not a millennial. I was just kidding.
No, but I have a question for you.
She definitely is. It's millennial at heart, right?
Last time I checked on Instagram, the goals had something like 100,000 followers. Yes, you have a couple celebrities that pull up a panel and take a picture, but how do you make these goals sexy? How do you make them cool? How do you get young kids to understand the colors, what the colors represent, what the numbers represent? I tattooed a 4 actually on me. We have something in common because I also am a big fan of quality education. But how do you get this movement going? Because the UN is such a big institution that's kind of lost a little bit of relevance with the younger generation.
May I just really quickly add to your question, which I think is a very good one, sorry. But how also do you build the community actually from the Global South? How are you incorporating sort of younger people from communities which you're not used to dealing with in the voice and the execution of how these goals will be achieved? Sorry.
Great. Maybe one more at the end, and then I promise we'll go toward the back of the room also.
Amanda Bolster with the Task Force for Global Health. Mine is actually similar in terms of how you build a collaborative aspect to it, because in a lot of the different sessions I've been in, we're all working in parallel and sometimes intersecting paths, certainly, but if there were a way from large NGOs and organizations down to small shops to be able to say, I'm working on number 4, this is what I'm doing. I'm working on 17, this is what I'm doing, so that people can start to be more efficient about the work that they're doing. If you're in a country that needs primary education and somebody's working on secondary, how can people build a community within the SDGs so that the work is more efficient and therefore more impactful?
Right. Let's go back to the panel. I'm happy to chime in at the end, but I want to maybe just start, we'll go down the end. Be last. Alyssa.
So a couple of things. I mean, on education, so not to contradict you, but the focus has, for the longest time, actually been on primary education. And so I don't see that necessarily stopping from traditional investors. But we would actually like to see a little bit more investment going not just to primary, but to post-primary. Because the reality is that if we want societies to thrive as well, we need to provide access to skills, right? So the tertiary access to education as well as the secondary education, right? So it's not enough to stop at primary. And the focus of the MDGs was frankly very much on primary education. So I would say that I'm encouraged by the fact that SDG 4 is now looking at this in a slightly broader way, and it's enabling a conversation about what do we mean when we talk about education, and what are the skills that we're hoping that people are going to have so that they thrive, and so that their societies will thrive, and that's got to be more than primary education. So I think we need to do, I would say it's primary plus. Yeah.
It's just that kids can't read. So after all this investment, kids still can't read.
Yeah, and in terms of how do we get more funders in the space, for instance, I think there's some interesting new ideas that are coming out. We were just talking in one of the earlier sessions with Educate Girls, and they're doing this development impact bond on education. And I think that's really interesting. It's a new way of bringing in an additional stakeholder into the space. They've been doing that with UBS and a few others. So we have to start being creative about the tools that we're bringing to this, because again, we're not going to get the kind of scale that we need if it's just traditional funding entities, whether that's philanthropic organizations or whether it's traditional donors. So we need to start thinking about who has a stake in education. Well, a lot of large multinational companies, for instance, also have a stake in whether or not the countries in which they're operating have a well-educated workforce. So they need to be thinking about how are they collaborating with ministries of education to think about the skills that are required going forward. So it's a very different conversation that we need to start having, I would argue. And then bringing it back just on how do you make the SDGs sexy, I'm with you. It's a frustration, and this is where I think UN Foundation's done some really great work, and so you should say some of the things that you've been doing. I think one of the things we've been looking at is how do you enhance global citizenship? So this idea of engaging kids right from primary school to think about where they sit in relation to everybody else. And so we used to have those kinds of programs. And so in part it's about reintroducing that into the curriculums, but not just in formal curriculums, but also in local after-school activities, in community centers. It's really approaching this to make the SDGs real on a daily basis, and this idea that you are a global citizen and you're tied to everybody else, and how do you make those connections? I think that's something that we could be exploiting a little bit more. Youth engagement at the UN, we can have a long conversation about that, and creating space for youth. And then there's other ways that have been happening. I mean, school does quite a good job of reaching down. What's the connection that they make to the global shapers that the World Economic Forum identifies, for instance? And how do we make sure that those kinds of youth that are being showcased aren't just elite youth, but it's all the different kinds of things that are being done that advance this agenda at the local level in different ways by young people who are amazing, but their stories don't get told.
Vivek, would you chime in on whatever the topics introduced? Yeah.
I like the question about the youth. One thing about Goal 16 is that it's the people's goal. You know, it takes a movement to achieve access to justice. The whole point is that development can't happen exclusively top down. And so there are these people, and a lot of them are young people around the world who are putting their lives on the line. I mean, Husmukh has gotten death threats. He's 26, who are walking with communities, trying to exercise rights, trying to take law out of books and courtrooms and put it in the hands of people. And so there really is this huge movement afoot. Many of the people in it are young, and I think there's an opportunity to tell those stories better. I would love to see Bollywood and Nollywood and Hollywood doing a better job of capturing that courage and those stories of what's happening, because I do think that culture is part of how you make progress on this.
Also that it doesn't have to be exceptional, right? It's the little things that are being done.
True. Yeah. I think that good movies or good fiction do that well, that capture that it doesn't have to be a hero story. It can be something that's everyday, part of everyday life. And then since you raised the question of financing and the kind of distribution of financing across goals, I would just say that to me there's a scandal with Goal 16, which is on the day that the SDGs were adopted, there were huge commitments announced for most of the goals. I might be getting these numbers not perfect, but something like 25 billion for healthcare for women and children, and 890 million for 25 billion for healthcare for women and children, and 890 million for child nutrition, which is important. And at least on education, there was commitments towards higher education, if not enough for primary education. Goal 16, nobody pledged a penny. We had that long fight. We had that long fight to get the words in the document, but no one pledged a penny. And it's not a coincidence. There's something specific about this question of legal aid, legal support, that is crucial, which is that it's different from other services like healthcare or education in that it is about holding the powerful accountable. That's what it is about. And so the powerful are inherently reluctant to pay for it. Legal aid is underfunded all over the world. The United States, totally underfunded. The UK had one of the finest systems in the world, but it's been gutted in the last 5 years, and it's likely to be cut further. And so with access to justice, I think now more than ever, the world recognizes how important it is and how essential it is to avoid what I was talking about, option number one. If you want to avoid authoritarianism and nativism, you need to allow people to take part in the institutions, make them more fair, make them more accountable. So we're asking the question, and with Goal 16, we're asking the question in a way that we never have before, but we need to now put our money where our mouth is.
And this is where some of the technology solutions can help you out. So for example, coming through the Solution Summit program is a company called BinBin by Noah Emmanuel in Ghana. And he's using blockchain technologies in order to provide certification of land ownership. And this is a really huge issue in a lot of countries around the world where you have native populations who have been living on a piece of land for generations. They themselves may not have a birth certificate or even a certification that they're a native of that country, but they've been there for a really long time. And then you have these companies come in and just take over with no way to defend that. And so you have technology opportunities like this that can come in and back up, you know, the legal feet on the ground to put this kind of certification in place that really empowers the local populations with a certification that they are there by right, that is their property by right, and that can't be taken away from them. So this is yay technology in that respect, you know. You know, I am a technology skeptic. I know that doesn't say a whole lot of that, does it? You know, technology is a great tool to enable people to do things that they haven't been able to do, but far too often you see technologists who are enamored with their technology solution, and they show up in these countries and they say, yay, look at my great piece of technology. Look at my great water purification system. I think that one of my favorite stories that I heard in Stanford at one point was a technologist came into a village in Africa and said, what do you need? Oh, I need clean water. Really? Yeah, I need clean water. Okay, great. So he comes back with this great water purification system that would turn the muckiest, nastiest thing that you've ever seen into pure drinking water. Great technology. And the villagers took one look at it and said, what's that? They go, it's the water purification system you asked for. They go, no. Our water's 5 kilometers that direction, and we have to basically walk all day each direction in order to get enough water for us to have our basic needs met. And so it was a transportation issue. And here's the risk that technologies go from coming from developed countries into undeveloped countries, is that sort of I know better than you mentality. I have a technology that you obviously want to adopt, and it can't be that way. You have to integrate people from day one into the adoption of technologies. That technology has to be about them, not about the technology. And really critical path forward to making scalable solutions actually execute properly that people want.
And I see a lot of demand in the audience,
Yeah.
but I think that, you know, just that issue of ensuring that resources are being directed at solving the right problems goes back to the need for more collaborative platforms. There are some platforms being built to allow people to share information and collaborate around the SDGs, including one in the funding space, something called sdgfunders.org. I think some of the individuals involved in that are actually here at the forum. There's initiatives happening in the private sector with companies organizing across sectors, in some cases coming together to work on particular cross-cutting issues. The UN Foundation, since I was asked to speak about it, is involved in a number of efforts that are trying to make the SDGs sexy, try to bring them to new audiences. There's almost so much more that could be done in this area that it's sometimes hard to know where to start. But we run a number of campaigns that get at the SDGs through particular issues. We have a program called Global Bureau, which is about training journalists and spokespeople around the world. I think, have been in over 36 countries with Global Bureau, and my colleague Caleb Tiller is here and can talk a little bit more about this. But I do want to turn back to the audience. Yeah, and we're using Hollywood, including most recently Smurfs. The UN is doing a lot more also than you would think in this area, including with youth. We will soon have a new youth envoy that the new Secretary General is appointing. There are youth advocates working on the SDGs, but again, you know, so much more needs to be done, and we need to be doing it in partnership with everyone in this room. Okay, sir, in the third row here.
Is that me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is John Oldfield. I'm with Water 2017, based out of Washington, D.C. Alyssa, just a quick question for you, and I guess maybe the whole room. The international donor community is not going to solve any development challenge, regardless of which SDG or SDGs it falls under. It's really public finance in developing countries and perhaps private finance, commercial finance in developing countries. So just a quick rifle shot, you know, what more should the international donor community do from a credit risk guarantee perspective to shake loose more local finance? And Vivek, thank you for making me smarter, in particular on Goal 16. It's underweighted upstairs here, and you've fixed that a little bit. And I'm at the point now where I look at Goal 16 as actually fundamental to the rest of the Sustainable Development Goals, you know, rule of law and democracy and governance, where I spent the first 5 or 6 years of my career. Question, you know, have you thought about going downstream or to younger people? I'm haunted by something I learned at the World Justice Forum in The Hague a couple of years ago. A primary school for rule of law is the Village Water Committee. A primary school for rule of law, for democracy and governance, is the Village Sanitation Committee or the Village HIV Preparedness Committee or something like that. I wonder if you've thought of going, I don't know what the right visual is, downstream there or not, but I think you're with me. And then just the specific recommendation would be to encourage, in some sort of pre-competitive way, some sort of a partnership with the World Justice Forum and the World Justice Project. I like the way they think as well. Thank you.
How about right here?
I'm an evangelist for the global goals and feel that they are super sexy and that millennials really react to them in that way. I mean, we're working in 58 countries in higher education, in business schools. We've had thousands of students that we've been teaching the global goals to and have them go out and find a company that is doing something innovative aligned with one or more of the SDGs. And they, I mean, there's nothing about the global goals in any textbook in the world right now. The textbooks in business schools talk about shareholder value. And so they're hungry for information like this and want to get out of the classroom and are having what they report back to us as a transformational experience about wanting to do something that has a social impact. I mean, really changing the trajectory of where they want to work, what kind of work they want to create. And it almost goes without saying that our governments are not going to achieve the global goals in the next 13 years. It's these millennials, it's the next business leaders that really are going to do it. What I find amazing in this room and that I'm excited about, there's so many people to connect with where I didn't know what you were doing on the SDGs. And so there really is a need to connect all of the dots. It's like you say, yeah, there's a new thing, you know, there are new groups popping up and organizing around the SDGs. There's a need to connect all of us so that we're not living in silos, all of us well-intentioned, but not knowing if you're reinventing the wheel in some way. And we need to be really efficient about it. So I brought my global goals with me too. I want to take a picture with anybody who wants to hold. Goal 4 for you. You got it.
Great. Okay. Toward the back. Long hair.
Thank you. Yeah, so my name is Marlu. I work for World Merit, and we work with the SDGs on a daily basis. So I resonate with everything that's been said. Sorry. So, you know, the main thing that the SDGs have done for us is just creating a common language, and I think that's where all collaboration starts. It was said before as well. It just helps open up the conversation if you realize that although you're working on different projects that you kind of like come together just because they all fall under a certain goal. My interest here, and especially it's the part of the uncertain world in the title that kind of draw me into this conversation today, because I feel like we're a year in. The strategy of the UN for the first 2 years was very much focused on raising awareness about the SDGs and making sure people know about it. And obviously in that first/second year, a lot has happened on a global scale and with global politics. So I'm wondering, a lot of people keep saying how pessimistic they are and how the world's, you know, we're all going down the wrong path. And I think it also creates a huge opportunity. And I think, you know, there's so many things and movements and energy going on in the US, but on a global scale as well. If people want to come together and rally around something like the SDGs to really get a movement going. So I was wondering, is there anything on a governance level or on a UN level that you feel like you're changing your strategy to really find that niche and find the opportunities that arise because of the way and because of the developments of the last year? And then I just want to say, as an idea, anyone who wants to connect with people here in the room, maybe it's an idea if everyone leaves their business card up front, and then at the end I'll collect them and send out like a massive email to connect people if people are up for it. So
That's just if you're interested.
Great idea. And there's clearly a strong theme here of the need for more collaboration, more platforms so we can share and learn what each other are doing. And I would just say that, I mean, the UN is also looking at how it needs to change, as you know, especially when it comes to implementation of the SDGs. There's a big effort now going on at New York to look at how the UN development system is organized, and I think this is a really important piece of this as well, because the UN can play, I think, a role of being a platform for different sectors to work together, but it's not set up that way now, as Alyssa, I think you referenced early on in our conversation. Should we just keep going with the audience and then come, okay, great. Right here. John.
Thank you. I like Laureen's technology. It's very unique and interesting. And I want to add my voice to John, who talked about the aspect of private sector financing. As you mentioned, there's this challenge of creating a business case for what I would call a social enterprise. I mean, I've not heard any mention about climate finance, and for an enterprise like yours, I would imagine this would present great opportunities. So I just want to have you comment on that. Thank you.
Okay. Lauren, do you want to start? We'll do
I'll
another quick round and then go back to the audience maybe for one more round.
I think well, you're hitting on something. You know, we talk about goal number 15, life on land, as our sort of go-to. The reality is that as we scale and get to 1 billion trees or more a year, we actually have a real climate change effect. So we do hit, you know, goal 13 on climate. And then again, when you hit at that level, you know, you effectively start hitting goals 1, 2, 3, 6, 8, 10. I mean, the knock-on effects are tremendous if you can scale solutions to that level. In terms of climate finance, the other ugly truth is that kind of climate finance is really dependent upon which governments are in power at the time, because, you know, carbon credits and other markets, they ebb and flow. So the way I look at it and the way I explain it to people is that when I get to this scale, what I'm really doing is protecting and expanding critical ecosystems, biodiversity at a local level. And that's an argument I can win every time. I can show you exactly what the value is of that as our project. When it comes to climate change, if you get one skeptic in the room, then you know what, you're spending all your time arguing with them and they've already made up their mind and you're never going to convince them. But I will win that argument every time on protecting biodiversity and those healthy ecosystems, water cycles, soil production. And my secret is that I can actually functionally change the global climate when I get to this scale. And that's really powerful. But I don't have to tell them that.
Well, first, thank you for the question. You said it better than I did, which is that this issue of access to justice, it cuts across. It's a thread. It's necessary for any of the other goals to succeed. And I love the question about what you call downstream institutions. Absolutely. The answer is yes. The motto that we use is know law, use law, shape law. I want everybody to be able to do those three things. Understand it, first of all. Use it to face a specific problem. You use it to solve a specific problem that you face, and then shape it. Take part in governance. Take part in the decisions that affect all of us. And so one of the things that paralegals do everywhere we work is they engage and support local governance bodies. So for example, we work on the right to health. We support village health committees, which are similar to water committees, focused on it's a space through which communities can govern health services. Myanmar, 50 years of the military grabbing land, they have now set up for the first time land reinvestigation committees that include 3 seats for civil society at every level, down to the village tract level. So a lot of our paralegals have gotten on those committees in the civil society slots. And sometimes our clients have. After working on their own problem, now they're on the committee trying to help other people get their land back. And so similar thing where it's a space for engagement in governance. And that is really, I think, crucial. That is what ultimately legal empowerment is about. It's about democratization. And I think to the question about how does this relate to the current climate, more than ever, we need democratization. I think that's the antidote to the really threatening trends that we are seeing. And on World Justice Project, love World Justice Project, one of the things that they're doing, if you guys haven't heard of them, that is a really important gap that they are filling is one of the doubts about putting justice in the development framework. People said, how are you going to measure it? Sounds good. How are you going to measure whether you're making progress on access to justice? And World Justice Project, which you mentioned, has a global index where they do surveys across over 100 countries, and they're working on methods by which you can actually track over time. So that's a really important contribution from them. One other thought on the question about the current climate. How does we passed these SDGs in 2015, a lot of things have changed. And so how does the current climate shape how we approach things now? On the access to justice side, one thing that I think is crucial in this current moment is protection. Is that the people who do this work, Hasmukh and people like him all over the world, they are under threat right now. They're under threat from the powerful interests that they take on, and they are under threat from governments who are increasingly closing the space that civil society has to act independently, to ask for accountability, to represent citizens. And so I think that is just a really crucial area for international cooperation, for media, is to protect that space for civil society, because if you don't have it, you're just progressing in a dangerous direction. And then last thing I was going to say is sort of a shout out or a plug, which is just on the point of collaboration, to the extent that people in this room are interested in these questions of legal empowerment and access to justice and how they relate to everything else we care about. This community takes 3 minutes to join. Nalmati.org is where the website is, and we would love to have you. And the whole purpose of that community is learning and collaboration and working on these things together, because it does take a movement.
And then how you're connecting to other things. I mean, I think of the work that Equitas does on training human rights defenders, for instance, and how do we bring these communities so that they're mutually reinforcing as well. Love John's question. It's the toughest piece of the puzzle, but of course it was a big part of the Addis agenda, right? So we've talked about how the SDGs were ultimately adopted in New York, but of course in Addis earlier in that year, we talked about the financing for all of this and how it was going to happen. And a big part of that is about domestic resource mobilization. And that means a lot of different things. We don't have time to get into all of it. A couple of high points that I would flag is obviously one is taxes and helping countries and governments to collect taxes and to do it in a meaningful way and to do it in a way that citizens will be willing to be taxed, right? So that addresses all kinds of issues and goes to the heart in some ways of SDG 16, right? It's the extent to which there's a level of trust between the people and their government that they feel that they're getting the services that merit them being taxed. And it can't just be taxing those at the bottom of the pyramid. It has to be that everybody gets taxed. But you have to have a system to be able to do that. So there's a whole conversation that's happening now with all of the finance folk about how do we help with this piece of domestic resource mobilization. But the other pieces that I would put to that is also that enabling environment for small and medium-sized organizations. That's also about domestic resource mobilization. It's enabling those entities to grow out of microfinance, not necessarily to be big, because you don't need to be big, but these small and medium-sized enterprises are the ones that hire the majority of people in all countries, right? But they can't often get out of that microcredit stream, and there isn't anything in the middle. We talk about this missing middle of finance, so that's another piece of that puzzle. Remittances is another part of domestic resource mobilization. Training and capacity building, and here I would add all kinds of other things like auditors, actually helping that system of governance so that you can make sure that when domestic resource mobilization is being done, it's actually then going back into the coffers to be used effectively and appropriately. And then the last thing I would say about domestic resource mobilization, which is probably the most important one, is gender equality. it's that 50% of the population, sometimes more, who, when they don't have legal rights, when they're not recognized, when they can't have land tenure, when they can't have bank accounts, when they don't have citizenship, when they don't have a passport, when they don't have a legal identity, well, you're cutting off enormous resource potential for countries to achieve the SDGs. So when we think about this agenda, gender equality is at the heart of it, and we must understand that it's at the heart of it from the very beginning. So if we're serious about domestic resource mobilization, let women work, give girls an education, because that's going to ultimately get us where we need to go in terms of achieving the SDGs.
On that education, are we running out of time?
We are running out of time, but I was
going to say that, you know, everybody pretty much probably remembers John F. Kennedy's, you know, speech on let's go to the moon, right? But the reality is that the space program didn't happen because of Kennedy. The space program happened because of the Eisenhower Defense Education Act in 1958, which dropped $1 billion in 1958 into all levels of education in the United States, which it continues to drive our entire GDP. So when you invest in education at every level, you can imagine what the results are going to be on a local and a national level.
Well, thank you. I know we are running out of time, but because we started with the audience, I actually want to end with the audience. I'm not going to open it up for more questions because I do think we need to leave this room. But does anyone in the audience have an idea that hasn't been brought up yet that addresses the main themes we were trying to get into today? How to ensure SDG momentum during times of political uncertainty, how to bring down some of these barriers for local action. Maybe I'll take 2 quick ideas because I see 2 hands.
Diaspora Network, I would encourage you to really engage the diaspora. I keep hearing sustainability. Why is the diaspora not a part of it? If you remember, the reason that we're, SDG is where it is right now, or the world is, a lot of us left our countries for better life. We have a vested interest to reinvest back in the continent. There's a huge amount of money, and just, I would leave you with this. The African diaspora gives 3 times more to the continent than it gets than AIDS. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity, and I would encourage you, Susan. I know you from different places, so I would encourage the UN to actually really invest in the diaspora, engage them in ways that has not been done before.
Great point. Thank you. Okay, you are the final word. It better be good.
Which is my custom. I'm Mark Wolf. I'm a federal judge in the United States. I'm here in my capacity as the chair of Integrity Initiatives International, which advocates for the creation of an international anti-corruption court to hold the kleptocratic leaders of countries who are robbing their countries of the funds necessary for health, education, welfare accountable. With everybody else, I was inspired by what Jim Kim said yesterday, but I know that 1/3 of the money that went to Sierra Leone for Ebola could not be accounted for except the part they were able to trace to the personal bank account of the people running personal bank accounts, of the people running the programs. And of course, he's right that massive investment in developing countries is necessary, but it's not possible for United States businesses or now UK businesses to invest in countries where bribery is endemic, because it's not just wrong, they face the threat of being prosecuted and punished. So in my view, a major impediment to achieving all of the Sustainable Development Goals, but particularly including the accountability and equal justice under Goal 16 is corruption. I would have asked the panel to comment on this, but I hope that all of you who are so passionately devoted to promoting the achievement of these goals will think about how corruption, and particularly the highest level corruption, can be deterred. In my view, it has to be through the effective enforcement of existing criminal laws that doesn't now exist in many of these countries because these corrupt leaders control the police, the prosecutors, and the courts.
Okay. Thank you. I want to be asked back to the forum, so I am going to stick with the rules and end us on time. I hope my panel's okay with us being a little in ending with the audience there. But thank you all so much. Leave your card if you want to stay in touch.